If you've been with us, as I see most of you have, over the last month, we're in a series called Good News for Today's World. And so what we've been doing is we've been taking topics which people care about in today's world, issues and values. We've looked at justice and family so far, and then we're trying to say, what does the good news say about those things? And so today, our topic is freedom, and we're going to continue with that same pattern. Freedom, in many ways, I think, is the cry of our age. To be free, to have my choice, my rights, is just everywhere, and we hear it all the time, and probably never more so than in lockdown. Although we're looking and longing for different types of freedom to leave your house and freedom to go see people, but freedom is on our lips. It's something that we're longing for. And so, like all the other topics we've taken, I want to show first how these issues are part of how God made us. And then when we see these values in the world, so many of them we can actually connect with. We can connect with culture. We can connect with these values. So we see that God created us with freedom. He gave us freedom. Adam was given a task in the garden in the second creation story in Genesis 2 to tend the garden, but he was free in how he went about that. He had freedom and creativity in naming the animals. He freely united himself to Eve in relationship. And in sort of morality and spirituality, he had freedom to eat of any tree apart from one. When we think of our spiritual freedom, we are free to serve God or not. That's such an important value freedom is to God himself, that he does not force himself on us, that we're free to serve him, we're free to follow Jesus or not. He offers an invite and we have freedom to respond. And we see Jesus not forcing himself on people. Jesus at times has disciples who leave him and decide to turn away. There's times he's speaking to people and he doesn't run after them when they decide not to follow him, like the young man who wouldn't give away all his money. So freedom is a key value for our God and for Jesus. And so we need to connect with this. We need to affirm this because it is good. It is a good thing that God has given us. Even though, like all the other things we've looked at, its expression in this world, the things that maybe people long for with their freedom are not things that we affirm. The core value of freedom is something that we can affirm. And so we should do so as part of connecting. But then we also critique. We also see the shortcomings in the view of freedom that are so evident in our world today. For many, freedom is defined as sort of the opposite of law. Freedom is to be free to do whatever you want. And the law is something that restricts, it stifles, it tells you not to do something. And so if we move away from the law, we reject the law, be it God's commandments, religion, any form of authority, then we feel free, because we can make our own choices. But here, Paul says something else. Paul talks about sin as a law. That sin actually acts as a law. He talks about the law of sin in verse 23 of what Maggie read for us in chapter 7. He says it's another law. It's a law because it operates on this principle that it seems like it's always there. It's always doing the same thing. It's like a law of our world. That sin is always at work, always influencing, always dictating us from the inside. That's what Paul is saying. It's like a law. So we're not free. We're not really free. We are subject to a law, the law of sin. Paul calls it the law of sin and death in chapter 8. And what's interesting is how he describes sin. He describes sin as a power and a force. So often we talk of sin just as the individual mistakes that we have made and talk about our sin being forgiven, which is of course true. But here Paul gets into this deeper notion that sin is a power and a force. Read verse 17 with me of chapter 7. It is no longer I myself who do it, but it is sin living in me. Living inside me, there's this alien force inside me dictating my actions. A power, a force within. That's what Paul is saying, and that's why we're not free. And it's not just that it influences. what we do. Like we've many influences from media or family or whatever, and it's just one other influence. He talks about it actually forcing and dictating what we do. It's no longer I myself who do it. I'm not acting myself. It's like sin is this separate actor. Its power is so strong on us. Verse 20, I do what I do not want to do. That says Paul. And he uses elsewhere a language of being a slave to sin and of being a prisoner. There is this power and force within. And that means that we're actually not free. Now, it's interesting looking at the language that Paul's used. If we skip over to chapter 8, if you have your Bibles open, chapter 8, verse 5 focuses on the language of desires. I find that really helpful. And it's really helpful to contrast with the language we hear when people talk about freedom today. People nearly always talk about choice. My choice, my right. That's how freedom is seen and expressed, that no one outside the government or church or whatever is going to stop me choosing what I want to do. You see, Paul is talking about desires. And desires to me seems to be a deeper notion of freedom. That actually this highlights that our contemporary notion of freedom is actually quite shallow. Because you see, our choices come from our desires. You know, it's our desires which influence the choices we make in situation A, B, and C. And so when Paul is talking about desires, it's a deeper notion of freedom. And so in some ways, our modern freedom that we talk about and that we value is an illusion. We might be free to make choices on a particular day, on a particular occasion, but actually, ultimately, those choices are being made by the desires within, which we don't have control over. We have an illusion of freedom with a particular choice. So it's all about desires. Now, what's interesting here, that Paul, as he speaks, he's talking about this battle within, that he is this battle and he's recognizing that he's conscious of this battle. That I don't think is going to be true in our culture today. This is a really tricky passage, chapter 7, because there's lots of different views as to what way Paul is speaking. Is Paul speaking of his own experience now as a Christian? Or is he speaking of before, when he was Saul and he was a non-Christian? Or something he's speaking as Israel the nation, or as an individual Israelite? And there's all these different views. Now, it doesn't really matter for our key point. The key point is that sin is a force or a power. But what it does mean is that if we don't take the view that Paul is a non-Christian, which would be hard to take because part of the struggle here is the desire to obey the law, which would imply it's someone who's a Christian, then this is not the view of people today. People are held under the power and force of sin, but they don't really experience like that. They don't recognize it like Paul does. In some ways, I like to think of sin as Stockholm Syndrome. You've heard of Stockholm Syndrome when there's a bank robbery or some rich kid is kidnapped and held hostage so that there'll be a big ransom for some millions from their parents or whatever it might be. And Stockholm Syndrome is when the hostage begins to identify with the people who've taken them captive. They don't realize that they're being held as some psychological response. And we're like that. We're held captive to sin. We don't actually see sin as this bad force within. So if people don't recognize it, then where do we go with this critique? We're under the power of sin, the force of sin, but we don't really see it. And it's helpful to look at idols. Idols are what we worship, what we long for, what we desire, what we dream about and hope for in life, which is not God itself. And idols determine the particular shape of our pattern of sin, how it particularly impacts us, our own individual architecture of sin in our hearts. And when we think of it like that, again, we might recognize our own idols, but we sure do see them in other people. And social media today, we sure do like to comment on the idols that other people hold. So if someone has an idol of money, that leads to greed. And we see this clearly. We see greed, we like to talk about greed in our society. I was reading again about that scandal with Davies, the biggest stockbrokers, and it struck me that they engaged in this unethical practice and trying to make money themselves, not for their clients, And one of the guys who did it already had 80 million in the bank as his net worth. Now, why would he engage with that, with so much money? Unless money has taken a hold of him. Greed. Or we see today the idol of appearance and beauty and image, and how that leads to this absorption in self and affecting all of how we eat and how we exercise and just all the things we do and how we look. Just watch Love Island to see some of that. So we can see that our desires do impact us. And when they impact us, we are not free. We're in tow to our desires. So that's my critique of culture, as Paul's critique of culture. We're not really free. We're not really free. But the good news of Jesus surpasses culture because Jesus offers us true freedom. He will set us free. This law, this power or force of sin that constrains us and takes away our freedom, Paul describes how Jesus takes it away. He says that he condemned sin. God condemned sin in the flesh. He condemned, he judged it, he punished it, he defeated it. Now, it's really interesting the language he uses here. He just uses the word sin. It's sin as this power or force that is condemned and judged. It's not, again, talking about individual sins, the things that you or I have done wrong. It's this deeper root issue which causes those individual failings that Paul is saying God, in one moment, is judging and condemning that force and taking away its power so that we can be set free. And he does it in the flesh. That flesh that he's talking about is Jesus. It says just at the start of the verse, God did by sending his own son in the likeness of sinful flesh. Jesus comes in the flesh. And that sin, all the sin of the world, the power and the force of sin, you see the sin from the political authorities who do a sham trial. You see the sin of the religious authorities of the day who just want to get rid of him out of jealousy and competition. And all that sin is on Jesus and condemned in his person. And that is the defeat of that power or force which constrains us. And that means that we can change. We can change. We can be free of this power. That is our true freedom. We can be free of this power. It says in verse 4, so he condemned sin in the flesh in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fully met in us. And I think what it's saying there is that actually we can live according to the good law of God. We can be changed. We don't have to just do what this power of sin is telling us to do. We can now be free. Because it's for those who live according to the Spirit. The Spirit now in us means we can live a different life and we can be free. We can be free. I want to sort of try and dig a little deeper because what intrigues me here is that there seem to be two different experiences of the law. Two different experiences of the law. And if I can suggest this morning, and I say this humbly as my illustration, and you might like it, you might not like it, but it seems to me that these two different experiences say to us that for people today, God's law is like Marmite. We use that phrase Marmite a lot, that you either love it or you hate it. You think of the actual spread Marmite you put on your toast, and then the phrase is being used for other types of food or a TV show or someone's personality. They're like Marmite. You hate it or you like them. And I think we've two different experiences of the law here. Some people hate it. 8 verse 7 says they can't submit to God's law. They are hostile to God. For people who don't follow Jesus and who don't have God's Spirit then living within them, the law comes as this external thing from the outside. It comes as an imposition upon them. They feel they have to obey the letter of the law. They feel it's negative. And that's their experience because God's Spirit is not within them. It's really important for us to note that part of that that love of freedom and the anti-law is because God's Spirit is not within them. But then for those who have God's Spirit, they're the people who love Marmite. It says in verse 5, they have their minds set on what the Spirit desires. Because their inside is different now, God's Spirit inside them, they have their mind set on it. So they want that, and they make their choices in that direction. There's an internal impulse. Their mind has changed, their focus has changed, their desires have changed. And so you act in that direction. Now, if that's true, if there's this Marmite part to God's law, then don't lead with the law of God when we're talking to other people. We're just going to play on their negative experience of religion in Ireland. The law says to people, because of sin, not that there's anything, and Paul is at pains to say this throughout the passage, it's not because there's anything wrong with the law, but because of how it interacts with this power of sin. What the law says to people is, you must do this. But the Spirit, when he lives, says, you can do this. One is a challenge. One is saying, you must do this. It's like some blunt object, like a hammer, banging at people, trying to get them to change their behavior and knocking at them. And it feels like negative, and it feels like an attack on their freedom. But the other, the Spirit, because he works from the inside out, changing our hearts, our desires, comes along and says, but you can do this. You can do it. The Spirit is not this blunt object, this hammer. The Spirit is a transplant of heart. It's a blood transfusion. It's something that comes into us and gives us new life. It's an entirely different experience. So when we talk about freedom and law, we have to realize that there's two different experiences. And so when we talk, please talk with the Spirit. And how the Spirit means we can change. We can lead different lives. We can do different things. Because that is really good news. I love this little phrase just to close. The mind governed by the Spirit. This is verse 6. The mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. Because Jesus came, this power of sin which affects all humanity is condemned in him. And so therefore those who are in him, those who follow Jesus, are now free of that. The Spirit can live in them, change their desires. And as that happens and grows in them, it's life and peace. It gives us life. And it's peace. It's well-fitting. It's what we were really made for. It releases us to be free to who we really are. It is true freedom. Freedom from these other desires and passions of that power of sin, of the particular idols that we follow. It is a true freedom. And we just need to be careful and think wisely how we speak about it. Amen.